Well, thank you very much, Joe, and to you and your team here at Heartland. What a fantastic conference that you have organised. Firstly, to the other elected officials here today, acknowledgements to you. More importantly, to the scientists that are here, I tip my hat to you. You are extremely brave, given all of the vitriol that comes your way. But I myself am not a scientist, and I've just got to look for my little PowerPoint thing. Whereabouts is that? The remote control? There. Great. Thank you. All right. Green is forward. So I'm not a scientist, so I won't attempt to prove nor disprove the impact that man is having on the temperature of the planet. I'm not a climatologist. I'm an elected representative of the Australian Parliament, so I would prefer to talk about my constituents, what they actually think, how they live, and how the policies around climate change have had an impact on their daily lives. Now, I'm also a fan of one of your great US television series here, Star Trek. Now, I'm talking about the original Star Trek, where Captain Kirk knew how to deal with destructive green beasts long before the show went all liberal and the Enterprise started saving whales. So I know good science fiction when I see it, and that is what I've seen in the climate change debate. A lot of fiction dressed up as science. Now, most great works of fiction end up on the silver screen. So it was inevitable that climate change would become a major motion picture. But a screenwriter has several angles to work with, and which one they choose depends on whereabouts on the climate change timeline which they pick up that story. Early on in the piece, it's a disaster-come thriller plot as prophets warn of impending doom of mankind and of the planet. The story then lurches towards some sort of slasher-style horror flick as even more graphic descriptions are used to scare the people into submission. Finally, the plot descends into a farcical comedy as government and environmental terrorists make ridiculous suggestions about how mankind will control the planet. Now, in Australia, we have actually crossed the point where the horror genre, or that disaster genre, has descended into a farcical comedy. The Australian political scene has been dominated for the past 7 years by the global warming debate and the political response to the hysteria. Global warming and its new incarnation, climate change, claimed one opposition leader and then 2 consecutive prime ministers in the Australian Parliament. So Australia is the obvious location for filming when this next blockbuster goes into production, Climate Change the movie. But it wouldn't be the first time that a movie has been made about climate change. In 1995, Universal Pictures launched what was at the time the most expensive movie ever made, Waterworld, starring Kevin Costner. It cost $235 million to bring it to the silver screen, but it grossed just $88 million in the North American box offices. Now, if you weren't in one of those empty theatres, Waterworld is also a science fiction story. It's a science fiction movie with a plot so far-fetched that even escapist moviegoers like myself couldn't buy it. And in the post-apocalyptic world they portrayed there, we had polar ice caps melted, the earth flooded, seriously flooded, leaving apparently just the peak of Mount Everest sticking out of the water. And in Waterworld, the protagonist was Kevin Costner. Well, in Australia, we had a snake oil salesman by the name of Tim Flannery. Now, Flannery is a paleontologist. He's an environmental activist and a global warming alarmist. Many of you might be aware of him. He was also appointed by the then government of the day as the head of Australia's Climate Change Commission back in 2011 on the basis of providing an independent and reliable source of information for Australians on climate change. Well, he failed. The Commission was also supposed to build a consensus to support the government's policy of introducing a carbon tax. He failed. And this is the reason why he failed. None of his hysterical claims and forecasts have come true. Most have been spectacularly wrong. As the chief snake oil salesman, Flannery was supposed to build this consensus, But the more he pushed the scaremongering envelope, the more people turned off. Flannery didn't predict seawater level rising to the Waterworld extent, but he did say this: picture an 8-storey building by a beach, then imagine waves lapping its roof. Now, if you've ever seen a tourism commercial for Australia, you would know that every Australian home has a sandy beach at the front doorstep and a kangaroo in the backyard. Now, every state capital in Australia is on the coast, and more than 80% of our population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. So Flannery casts this pretty big net when he tries to scare the wits out of coastal communities and capital cities. And if they weren't frightened enough to buy his snake oil, he also said that Perth, the capital city of the largest in geography Australian state, would run out of water. Perth will be the 21st century's first ghost metropolis. This is a familiar theme in Flannery's prophecies. He said that Sydney's water supply would be dry as in a little as 2 years. He said, and I quote, "Even the rain that falls isn't actually going to fill our dams and our river systems." He said that the capital cities of Adelaide, Sydney and Brisbane, quote, "need desalinated water urgently, possibly in as little as 18 months. Now, Flannery's disaster-come thriller plot was turning into a horror movie. But Brisbane didn't need desalinated water because the rains Flannery said would never come, they actually did come. Floods in 2010 and 2011 forced the evacuation of thousands of people from Brisbane and more than 70 other towns. The floods we were told would never come killed 38 people and caused more than $2 billion in damages. We were told our dams would never be filled again, but Wivenhoe Dam reached 190% of its capacity. 3/4 of my home state of Queensland was declared a disaster zone, and the floods were followed later that year by more floods in the southern state of Victoria. But former global warmists who prophesied about drought have now switched to become climate changes, and this accounts for floods as being a sign of man's carbon sins as well. But the truth is that Australia is not a stranger to either droughts or floods. The poet Dorothea McKellar penned her most famous verse about Australia: "I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains." Now, McKellar penned that verse more than a century ago. More than a century ago, in 1896, a heat wave stretched Australia right across Australia for weeks. The death toll reached 437 people in the eastern states. And yet a heat wave in 2009 has been sold as the worst in 150 years. This claim is assisted by a convenient deleting of history, which has been justified with claims of poor thermometer placements in the past. Now, alarmists claim that thermometers were once placed in the sun, and in 1896 the temperature in the outback town of Bourke was at or above 102 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 days straight. In Brewarrina, the thermometer read 109 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight. Now, I don't know about you, but put a thermometer in out there at midnight and I'm not sure how it's getting the sun. But the weather and climate in Australia has not changed in the last century, but a new religious interpretation of that has arisen since. Now, when we're in a drought, they tell us the lack of rain is a sign. When we're in a flood, they tell us that all this rain is a sign. More hurricanes or cyclones is a sign. Fewer cyclones is a sign. The sky's blue, it's a sign. Gravity, it's a sign. A new religion has been born, and those who refuse to kneel down before the inconvenient altar shall be cast out. We had a visitor to Australia 2 weeks ago. Al Gore popped in with his constant companion, an entourage of blizzard-like conditions, freezing temperatures that are such a constant companion of Al Gore's jet setting that they have inspired the new meteorological term, the Al Gore effect. And he did. He came into Canberra. We had the coldest day on record, and it brought record snow. So Once again, the polar vortex descended to the southern hemisphere just in time to give Al another cold reception. And since the globe has failed to warm, alarmists have adopted the more non-committal terminology of climate change, which helps explain any inconvenient truths like lack of warming or record freezes. But where the alarmists like our Tim Flannery come unstuck is when they make specific predictions that prove specifically wrong. Now, in response to the disaster thriller scaremongering claims about our cities running out of water, Australia built 5 desalination plants at a cost of more than $9 billion. Now, only one of them is still operating. 4 of them have been mothballed. The water from these plants was going to be up to 10 times more expensive for householders than dam water. But that turned out to be wishful thinking, especially for plants that didn't produce a drop of water. The worst offender is the desalination plant that sits idly by in Melbourne. The cost of having that desalination plant there, producing no water at all, is $384 for every single household in Melbourne every year for the next 30 years. If it were ever to produce any water, that cost would increase. Now, Australian policymakers were threatened and cajoled into undertaking these farcical plans for desalination plants on the back of menacing doomsday climate prophecies. You would think that after these desalination disasters that any sensible government would be too scared to go back in the water again, certainly not without a bigger boat. But they did. In 2004, Energitech developed a taxpayer-funded prototype wave generator off Port Kembla, which broke free of its pylons and sank to the bottom. In 2012, a second prototype, having been decommissioned, was rusting away. But if it's worth doing something dumb once or twice, well, it's worth doing 3 times, because this year, Ocean Links, who are formerly known as Energitech, reported the airbags supporting a new 3,000-tonne prototype had burst and the unit had sunk. So it now looks like a salvage operation will take a year to remove the wreckage of that alternative energy and taxpayer-funded folly. Having the carcass of stupidity polluting the marine environment for the next year is bad enough, but that is peanuts compared to what might just be the dumbest, the weirdest, the most bizarre attempt to fight carbon dioxide that we will ever witness anywhere on the planet. The ultimate folly would have left thousands of carcasses strewn across the continent of Australia because global warmists pointed the finger at flatulating camels. It's true. The climate boffins in Australia produced a 62-page proposal to issue carbon credits for killing camels. Can you imagine the chaos that would be created not just in culling the beasts, but in policing the credits? There would have been an explosion of camel culling police, regulators, inspectors, prosecutors and auditors, and someone had already wrestled with the problem of producing more carbon in the process than what might actually be saved. So hence, a formula was derived to measure any possible net gain. And a complicated formula it was too. This is real. Note that GD/GV/CJY equals the ground distance travelled by the vehicle, or GV, using fuel type J and undertaking the activity C in the year Y. Also note that LPKGVJ equals the litres of fuel type J combusted per kilometre for the vehicle, or GV. Got that? Well, it's no longer a disaster movie, it's no longer a horror movie. Right now we're in the bowels of a farcical comedy. Shooting wild camels armed with a mathematical formula and reporting to the camel police might be a job creator, but it's not a climate solution. That might have been the thinking of former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard when she floated the idea of the Green Police to investigate households using too much power. Her plan was to require power companies to meet tough new efficiency standards by conducting audits of their customers and telling them to upgrade inefficient appliances. The Green Police were to go door to door, sticking their noses into everybody's lives on behalf of a government intent on perpetuating the global warming hysteria. The Gillard government even provided $3 million in grants to organisations who could help them sell their snake oil. By this stage, the Labor government, which Julia Gillard represented, had already introduced a carbon tax when they specifically promised not to do it. And in fact, that photo there is from a television interview, and that's the quote that she made days before the election. But after they'd backflipped on that and brought it in, they started advertising for help to come up with a reason why we needed the carbon tax and to sell that idea to the public. Now, if you listen to the alarmists, there's no shortage of reasons why something needs to be done, even if the reasons are paradoxical. Even on something as simple as trees, the alarmists can't seem to get their story straight about what the alleged impacts might be. One day the alarmists are telling us trees will grow slower, the next day they're saying that trees will grow faster, the next day it's trees are less colourful, the next day they'll be more colourful. We've even heard claims about trees growing in Antarctica. And these are all actual reported claims made by climate alarmists that have been reported in the media. I kid you not. There are plenty of other environmental catastrophes in the pipeline according to other media reports. Global warming will make poison ivy more prevalent and itchier. It'll change the sex of lizards and make them smarter. It'll cause volcanic eruptions. The claim about volcanic eruptions might have been made after an alarmist support group's hosting of an all-night volcano movie marathon. Perhaps they watched Joe versus the Volcano, Dante's Peak, Volcano, Super Volcano all through the night and finished it off with that movie 2012 and thought, wow, that'd be a good thing to blame on climate change. It's hard to tell the difference between an alarmist claim and, I'm sorry, I'm going backwards here. It's hard to tell the difference between an alarmist claim and global effects and the basic premise of a disaster movie. See if you can spot Hollywood movies among these disaster plots. Tigers eating people, different shark species interbreeding to produce a hybrid shark, supersized spiders with a passion for biting, alligators in the Thames, a herpes epidemic in oysters, invasions of alien worms, Antarctic aliens, Asian carp, cane toads, caterpillars, cats, herons, jellyfish, king's crabs, lampreys, midges, pine beetles, rats, slugs, stingrays, walruses, or all of the above. Now, I don't know how many of them have been made in the movies, but every single one of them is a global warming claim. Now, spare a thought also for the penguins, because apparently their chicks are going to be frozen, their chicks are going to be smaller, penguins will be in the dark, their population's devastated, sex lives affected, and they're going to end up being replaced with jellyfish. All claims that have been made. We can also expect the extinction of Wolverine, which is sad news for my fellow Australian Hugh Jackman and the X-Men franchise. But the news is no better for humans. Hollywood already has a list of disease movies to scare audiences like Outbreak and 28 Days Later, I Am Legend, Quarantine. But screenwriters need look no further for inspiration than alarmist claims that global warming will cause stress, anxiety and depression, increase the incidence of post-traumatic stress, cause an explosion of asthma in children, cause bubonic plague outbreaks, release ancient viruses into the atmosphere and make us all fat. I've got to say I started on that one a bit early, but it wasn't global warming. Apparently society is already crumbling in Africa with a decline in circumcision and marriage due to global warming, and that actually come from our very own Tim Flannery. According to alarmists, if we don't do something to cool the planet, we'll see an escalation of intelligence and spying wars as well as writing a nuclear war. Global warming has already been described as a weapon of mass destruction, but if you want a bizarre plotline, there's a whole solar system and universe out there to be impacted by camel flatulence. Now, according to the alarmists, global warming has already caused the Earth to tilt, changing the sun and stars we see in the sky, and it gets worse. There's going to be more asteroid strikes, even claims of more UFO sightings. Global warming will prevent contact with alien civilisations, though, and through all of this, we're going to have to deal with the dead rising from their graves. Well, not in the zombie way, but the story goes that with water levels rising, dead bodies are going to be pushed out of the ground. More execution of witches in Tanzania, a prostitute shortage in Bulgaria, increased cannibalism and more amorous cats. These are all true claims that have been reported in the media about global warming. You couldn't make this stuff up. And then there's the death of the Loch Ness Monster. Nessie Hunter Robert Rhines has ended his 37-year search because apparently Nessie is dead, possibly the victim of global warming, he says. And the Pirates of the Caribbean movie franchise will have an unlimited supply of new plot lines. According to the chief climatologist for alarmist group Climate Central, I refer to Heidi Cullen in her book, The Weather of the Future, she claims pirates will run rampant in a globally warmed world. Well, I look forward to Johnny Depp doing Pirates of the Antarctic. Finally, some movie screenwriters were obviously ahead of their time with classic flicks like Unfaithful and Indecent Proposal, because global warming, do you know, is already causing women to cheat on their husbands. Now, there have been several reports now of extramarital affair websites claiming global warming is causing their clients to stray, women more often than men. Now, that's important given that we're here in Sin City. You know the saying, so help me out with it, please. What happens in Vegas? Well, it did once, but with this new information, what happens in Vegas may also appear in the next government research grant-funded paper on the impact of man-made climate change. But women are also getting the rough end of the deal because there's also claims that climate change will kill more women than men. Now, I read this morning another one, the impact that this is going to have on the red-headed people in our population because they come from Ireland and Scotland and it's going to get hotter, there'll be less redheads. Well, thank God there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Look, I say that only because of our former Prime Minister. Now, what we need to see is we've seen what global warming will cause, pretty much everything, and then now we've got to look at what the response is. Now, a thought bubble, not a thought bubble response, but an actual response of a parliament or a legislature, the Australian Parliament. Now, our carbon tax was at $23 a tonne. Australia's previous government introduced that tax 2 years ago, taxing companies at that rate for each tonne of CO2 emissions. The fixed price rose to $24.15 over the first year and rose again on July the 1st to $25.40 a tonne. A shotgun inquiry was conducted into the tax, but the inquiry was given just 3 weeks and forced to start blindfolded. There was no legislation drafted. The modelling that had been done on the impact of the carbon tax wasn't released until minutes before the inquiry actually began, and I was actually appointed to that carbon tax inquiry as an opposition MP, and I had the opportunity to grill Ross Garnaut, an economist who was behind the originally proposed cap and trade legislation in Australia, which had morphed into this carbon tax, and he'd been brought in to sell the new carbon tax. And this is a transcript from the inquiry there, and I asked Professor Garnaut, is it a distortion of reality to state that regional communities and industries are likely to become more vulnerable due to the impacts of this legislation than urban centres due to their reliance on agriculture and other natural resource-based industries and low levels of infrastructure stock? And he replied, well, I do not think it's true, and then went on to elaborate. Well, I said to him, that's very interesting because I was actually just quoting you out of chapter 16 of your report, sharing the burden in Australia. So Garnaut knew exactly what the impact of the carbon tax would be on industry, on businesses, families. He knew that a carbon tax like the one being proposed, the biggest and widest carbon tax in the world, would place Australian industry at a disadvantage. He knew industries would be forced to close down. He knew people would lose their jobs. He knew that emissions would still go up after the carbon tax was introduced. But there in front of that inquiry, he was a salesman first and the economist second. Now, a Deloitte Access Economics report showed that my home state of Queensland would be the worst affected under the carbon tax. It showed the region that I represent in the Parliament would be the worst affected in that state. Our main agricultural industry, growing sugarcane, would cop an $81 million slug due to the carbon tax, and in an industry where 87% of that crop is exported overseas, that tax placed local farmers at a distinct competitive disadvantage. And the same story applied to tourism, where the majority of tourists in the world famous Whitsundays and my election come from overseas. A report predicted that the $26 a tonne carbon tax would drive $266 million of domestic tourism offshore and reduce inbound international tourism by around $457 million. An independent report warned a number of mines would close down and 4,000 jobs would be lost under the carbon tax. It was understating it. We've actually had over 15,000 jobs lost in the coal sector after this policy was brought in. So we knew before it was introduced just how much damage it would do to our three key industries, and still it was introduced in one of the greatest acts of economic self-harm that has ever been enacted by an Australian Parliament. Of the 150 members of the House of Representatives, 149 went to the election preceding the carbon tax coming in, promising not to have the carbon tax. Only one member promised to advocate for it, and a hung Parliament meant that that one person's party, the Australian Greens Party, had the power to destroy people's lives for no benefit to the environment. Now, that carbon tax inquiry I talked about received more than 4,500 submissions, but the committee only accepted 350. I attempted to table the overlooked submissions, which were all against the carbon tax, mind you, a 2-foot-high stack in Parliament, but the Labor-Greens alliance denied those voices even from being tabled into Parliament. And so Australia went out and led the world in folly. Nothing happened to change the world, nor the globe's temperature. We still have droughts, we still have floods, the tropics are still warm and Antarctica is still cold. In fact, alarmists are now trying to blame the next ice age on global warming. They have to because of an inconvenient truth about the expansion of ice in the Antarctic. At the end of last year, Chris Turney, an Australian, led an expedition of tourists and climate activists to the Antarctic, retracing the voyage of the explorer Douglas Mawson. Now, the expedition of irony was trapped in ice that they were there to prove didn't exist. Not only was that ship of fools stranded in sea ice some 70 kilometres from where Mawson landed, the ship sent to rescue them also became stranded. Before the expedition, their claims were that a loss of sea ice is a sign of global warming. After the expedition, their claims changed to too much sea ice is a sign of global warming. Well, it's time we called Kevin Costner back into service. The remake of Waterworld should become Ice World, because even if the planet were up to Mount Everest's neck in ice, it would still be the fault of global warming. And I'd like to leave you with one final prediction that we can all look forward to celebrating, because in all of these claims, the alarmists were bound to set a deadline that they could be held to account on. And this one came from Australia's then Chief Scientist, Professor Penny Sackett. She warned us that the planet had just 5 years to avoid disastrous global warming. Note the dateline, December the 4th, 2009. Less than 5 months out from the deadline, we're expecting the next apocalypse movie to be enacted in real life, and I perhaps will see you there at the premiere on December the 4th. But then again, I'm guessing it's just going to be a complete flop, like all the other climate change disaster plots have turned out to be, or will turn out to be. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.